lace curtain sways, hiding the truth of a deadly meeting. Welcome to Echo Files. I am your host, Walter Finch. Drop a comment with your location. Your voices make this journey richer. Let's uncover the mystery. A late summer sun shone gently over St. Mildred's, the small, picture-perfect village that sat neatly between a curve of hedgerows and the quiet, sloping meadowlands. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the garden of Mrs. Elspeth Withers was in full bloom. A riot of roses, delphiniums, and sweet peas. She was hosting her annual lace and lavender tea, an event of mild importance on the village calendar, where one could expect butter sponge, gossip in generous slices, and the faint air of competition over who brought the best preserves. The lace curtains at her bay window, cream with a delicate scallop, fluttered in the light breeze that carried the faintest scent of lavender oil. From her seat near the tea urn, Miss Marple sipped delicately from her cup, her eyes wandering, not with any apparent intent, but in that mild, distracted way that often made others assume she was thinking about church flowers or knitting patterns. It was shortly after 3 when the atmosphere shifted. Mrs. Edith Taylor, a brisk, thin woman with a fondness for keeping village affairs in precise order, had excused herself to fetch a jar of her famed blackcurrant jam from the pantry. Moments later, a high, startled cry pierced the gentle hum of conversation. Teacups clinked hastily back into saucers as several women rose in alarm. Edith appeared in the doorway, her face drained of color, her hands clutched to her chest. "In the drawing room, by the window," she managed, before sinking into a chair. The guests followed her gaze toward the large front room. At first glance, the space was unchanged. The afternoon light streaming through the lace curtains, the vase of dahlias on the table, the neatly arranged books on the sideboard. But just beyond the gauzy folds of curtain, half concealed in their shadow, lay a figure slumped against the wall. A man, unknown to any present, his head bent at an unnatural angle, and one arm stretched limply toward the open window. The lace curtain stirred faintly, brushing his shoulder like a ghost's hand. The shock of it was almost theatrical. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered about calling the constable. A few women stepped closer, then recoiled, as if proximity might somehow implicate them. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture. Only the strange stillness of the body and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Miss Marple set down her teacup very carefully, as if nothing more untoward had occurred than a sudden change in the weather. She glanced toward the body, her expression thoughtful, almost sympathetic. "Poor soul," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Though I dare say, he did not come here entirely by accident." Her comment was lost in the rising babble of speculation. Was it a vagrant? A criminal? Someone from the next town? Mrs. Withers, white-faced but determined, insisted they wait for Inspector Graves before moving anything. Yet even as the others speculated, Miss Marple's eyes returned briefly to the lace curtain. The faint crease along its hem, the unusual way it had caught against the sill. It was the sort of detail that most would miss. But to her, it was already whispering a story. This was no mere intrusion, she thought quietly. Something had been set in motion long before the man's lifeless form appeared here. And somewhere, behind the pleasant faces and polite murmurs of her fellow guests, was someone who knew exactly why. The room did not empty so much as gently rearrange itself around the emergency, like the heads of flowers turning toward an unexpected gust. Mrs. Withers, pale and resolute, sent young Lily the maid through the back hall to fetch Constable Finch from the post office side, where he sometimes idled. Failing him, the telephone stood ready for the larger machinery of county authority. In the meantime, conversation, which had retreated into shocked silence, came back with a curious blend of whispers and overbright courtesy, as people offered one another tea they did not want and refused cake they would ordinarily have fought for. It is the way of small places to dress alarm in manners. Dr. Pembroke was present, as fortune would have it, enjoying a rare afternoon untethered from bronchial children and rheumatic elbows. He pushed through the fringe of ladies and knelt by the slumped figure with the brisk kindness of a man who had knelt by too many. His hand went to the wrist, then to the neck. He looked up and shook his head, not dramatically, but with a practical sorrow. "He's gone," he said. "For some time, an hour at least, perhaps 2. The doctor's eyes tracked across the window, the lace, the angle of the head. "Neck injury. Not recent, I think. But aggravated or... no." He did not finish. Something in the quiet line of the shoulder made him purse his lips. "We mustn't move him until Inspector Graves comes." Miss Marple, who had neither pressed forward nor retreated, stood at a distance that was tactful and observant. She saw how the lace lay against the man's sleeve, how the hem, delicate scallops hand-finished long ago, had a faint, uneven crease, as though an impatient fist had crumpled it and later smoothed it out again. Cream lace keeps the memory of fingers if one has the habit of looking. She noted as well the vase of dahlias on the occasional table, its water clouded from the stems. Around the base, a ring of droplets suggested it had been recently moved and returned to its place with less care than usual. "She didn't scream until 3:30, whispered Mrs. Hartley Pease to Miss Blount behind a gloved hand that did not quite conceal either the whisper or the relish. Edith Taylor, always precise. I saw her check her little watch twice. Because she wanted us all to know the time, you think?" Miss Blount whispered back, and then started as she caught the faintest glimmer of amused patience in Miss Marple's eyes. When a person believes she is whispering covertly in the presence of Miss Marple, she's like a child playing hide-and-seek behind a lace curtain and thinking herself invisible. Constable Finch arrived with more haste than dignity, his bicycle abandoned in the hydrangeas and his helmet slightly askew. He had the air of a conscientious terrier and a firm belief in procedures he would have to recall in the correct order. He planted himself in the doorway of the drawing room and held up a hand. "No one come in or out from here," he announced, then softened it with, "If you please." His glance swept over the body without settling on it. "I'll ring Inspector Graves." He looked to Mrs. Withers. "Ma'am?" "Telephone." "In the morning room," she said. "Lily will show you." Her composure cracked a little. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips and then recovered as swiftly as a woman whose hospitality had been mortally offended by death on her carpet. "Do, please, keep your tea," she told the room. "And if anyone feels faint—" "Salt," said Dr. Pembroke. "And air. Crack a window in here, Finch, but not the one near him." Finch nodded and hurried out, his boots thudding across the polished boards. The gathering began to sort itself like tea leaves into clusters. The widow Hartley Pease took charge of the more delicate ladies, suggesting a rest in the shade near the pergola. Mrs. Edith Taylor sat rigidly upright, clutching her reticule. Several women tried to coax her into sips of water without success. She had the dazed look of one whose inner schedule had been catastrophically disrupted. She would speak, when she spoke, with the calm flatness of a person counting list items. Door, window, jam jar, scream. Miss Marple, with that friendly vagueness that had misled more self-confident men than Inspector Graves, drifted toward the bay window as though to admire the roses beyond. She did not push the lace aside. She did not lift the vase. She merely looked, and in the looking arranged a few small questions in quiet order. The open lower sash had been raised 1.5 feet. The paint on the frame bore a fresh scuff where something, not a hand, had pressed or scraped. The sill had a faint smear, pollen yellow, she thought, where a sleeve or edges of something had brushed against the summer dust. On the floor, under the lip of the table, a tiny splinter lay, no bigger than a fingernail, its wood darker than Mrs. Withers's polished oak, and caught on the lowest scallop of lace, so fine you could think it part of the fabric, a short dark fiber, coarser than the light summer suits worn by most of the gentlemen of St. Mildred's. It might have been nothing. But Miss Marple had once watched a charwoman's son return from the city in a suit cut cheaply from hard-wearing worsted. She knew the feel of it against the eye. Finch reappeared, breathless with news he could only partially claim as his own. "Inspector Graves is on his way from Much Bearing," he reported. "Says we're to keep everyone here who was in attendance at the tea within reason." He looked apologetically at Mrs. Withers. "Sorry, ma'am." "Of course," said Mrs. Withers. "Everyone will remain. It is the least we can do." The village, being deeply itself, obeyed and gossiped. Names were offered to Finch, who wrote them down in a blunt pencil. Mrs. Hartley Pease, Mrs. Blount, Mrs. Edith Taylor, Miss Larkins, who played the organ at St. Mildred's and had extremely decided views about everything except music, where she wisely deferred to Bach. Mrs. Pritchard, quiet, anxious, always ready to help and never certain how. Lily the maid, and 2 gentlemen, Mr. Clement Nash and Mr. Harold Rudge, both of whom had called to deliver, respectively, stationery samples and a pamphlet about the Horticultural Society's September fete. Then lingered on the lawn at Mrs. Withers' invitation, for tea is a solvent that dissolves the edges of an errand. There were others, too, from the far fence and the near lane. In summer, the boundaries between guest and passerby grow porous. Inspector Graves arrived half an hour later with the even tread of a man who believed in sturdy shoes and unhurried thought. He was not sentimental over corpses, though he was kindly toward the living. He greeted Dr. Pembroke, nodded to Mrs. Withers, and let his gaze settle without strain upon the figure at the window. "No one touch anything," he said out of habit, and then set about asking quiet, practical questions. "It was Mrs. Taylor who first saw him," he confirmed. "Where were you, madam?" "In the pantry," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I went to fetch the blackcurrant jam. I came through the hall. One always comes through the hall to the drawing room when one is a guest, I think, and I saw him there by the window. He was not right. I said so, and then I called out." "You did not touch him?" "No, indeed. Did anyone?" A murmur. "No, certainly not." Dr. Pembroke had checked, of course. Finch had stood guard after. The answers fell in place like sensible paving stones, and yet Graves looked at them as though aware that people, unlike stones, sometimes shift underfoot. "Who is he?" asked Mrs. Hartley Pease with the bluntness wealth sometimes permits. "Does anyone know him?" No one did. The man had a lean, worn look, the turned-down collar of his shirt frayed where it rubbed the neck. His hair had been cut recently, but not expensively. His shoes had been mended neatly, if not professionally. In his jacket pocket, Finch found a folded slip, half a railway ticket from the morning, St. Mary Mead to St. Mildred's via Much Bearing, stamped and torn. No purse, no letters. In the other pocket, a small sachet of dried lavender, home-sewn by the look of it, a scrap of faded chintz with lavender buds spilling through a gap in the stitches. Edith Taylor, who had made batches of such sachets for the church bazaar last Christmas, blinked at it with a surprise too honest to be feigned. "Someone gave it to him," ventured Miss Blount. "Or he stole it," said Miss Larkins, to whom the gray world divides crisply into right and wrong. Mrs. Pritchard murmured that perhaps it was sentimental. People kept odd things if there were memories attached. No one mentioned aloud the potent village fact that Mrs. Withers's late husband, a haberdasher of taste and temper, had liked his house to smell faintly of lavender, and that Mrs. Withers had never quite discarded the habit of tucking little sachets into drawers and behind curtains. Scents cling to places and to people. And to that day, Miss Marple would always connect the memory of this dead stranger with the clean, dusty sweetness of lavender. Graves crouched to peer at the window frame. "Finch, the sill," he said. "Mark those smears." He looked at the base of the vase, at the ring of droplets. Was this moved? Mrs. Withers hesitated. "I do not think so," she said. And then, with a small frown at her own uncertainty, "Lily dusted this morning. Things are sometimes not quite as you left them after a good dusting." "Where is Lily?" The girl came forward, twisting her hands in her apron. "I dusted the drawing room just after 11, sir," she said to Graves, eyes lowered. "I moved the vase to polish the table. I put it back. The water, it might have dripped. I'm sorry, ma'am." Mrs. Withers touched her shoulder in forgiveness. The effect was to make Lily's eyes fill and her shoulders stiffen with gratitude. "You left the window as it is now?" Graves asked. "No, sir. The sash was down then. Mrs. Withers asked me to raise it around 2 when it felt close." "Which you did?" "Yes, sir." "From the bottom?" "The bottom, yes." Graves nodded, a man setting pegs in his mind. "Very good. Dr. Pembroke will give me his time of death estimate. Finch, keep people together. Garden is fine, until we've taken statements." The congregation disassembled into neat little flocks under the pergola, as at a summer service that had strayed outdoors. The village talked with the bright, deliberate animation of those who understand that silence may look like guilt. Mr. Rudge, the horticultural man, declared he had been on the far side of the lawn comparing delphinium steaks with Mr. Nash when Mrs. Taylor cried out. Mr. Nash, whose samples of cream-laid paper and tinted envelopes lay on a side table with the air of embarrassment that attends business at a funeral, confirmed this. Edith Taylor repeated her steps with occasional, involuntary glances toward the house, as though the doors and windows might contradict her. Mrs. Hartley Pease asked Miss Marple whether she had noticed anything. "You have a way of observing dear little things, Miss Marple. You always have." To which Miss Marple replied that one never knows what one has noticed until later, which was her way of not telling people what they wanted to hear until she was certain. Graves came to stand beside her, hands behind his back. "You were in the room," he said, not so much as a question as an anchor for whatever she might choose to attach to it. "I was," Miss Marple said. "And before that, in the garden, where I could see the bay window. I do like to watch how curtains move. They can be quite informative." He regarded her with the blink of a man stepping from bright sun into a shaded church. "Informative how?" "Oh, in the way that a curtain sometimes catches. It speaks to drafts, you know, and to whether a person passed quickly or slowly. And to temperament," she added, as if this were obvious. "The impatient and the secretive handle lace quite differently." "You saw someone near the window?" "I saw many people near the window," she said mildly. "But not the one I think truly matters." She glanced toward the pergola, where Edith Taylor's reticule rested precisely by her elbow. "Mrs. Taylor's timekeeping is very reliable. She is a great believer in rightness. People who believe in rightness are very good at noticing wrongness. She lowered her voice. But I should like to know who raised the lower sash just a little more after Lily, and who crushed the lace and then tried to smooth it. The fingers were not housewifely. They have not been accustomed to delicate things. Graves followed her gaze to the hem. You think it happened after 2? It is often after 2, Miss Marple said, as if reciting a proverb about puddings. When even the nervous admit the day will go on being warm. He grunted, neither assent nor denial. We'll send his description round the stations. Someone will know him. Someone here knows him, Miss Marple said, with a softness that made the words feel less like accusation than sorrow. If not his name, then his reason for coming. Toward 5, the light shifted, and the scent of the garden lifted like a veil. The coroner's men came for the body, and people looked away in that exaggerated fashion, which means they could not bear to look, and could not bear to be seen, not looking. Graves took preliminary statements with Finch at his elbow and let people go at last, by 2s and 3s, as if releasing children after school. First, those whose errands were pressing, then those whose pressing errands were invented. He kept a small handful longer, among them Edith Taylor, Lily, Mr. Nash, and Mr. Rudge. He returned to the drawing room alone for a moment, as a man will return to the hearth after guests have gone. Not for warmth, but to see what the room feels like, without voices. Miss Marple had drifted in as if on the same impulse. She looked at the half-ticket on the sideboard, where Finch had set it. He came to St. Mildred's, she said. From St. Mary Mead. Graves' eyebrow went up. Your village? Yes, said Miss Marple. And of course, many people pass through St. Mary Mead as they pass through life. But the lavender sachet, you know. We had quite a number of them at the bazaar. Mrs. Taylor sewed a most economical stitch, with a habit of catching the corner backwards. She nodded to the sachet in Finch's envelope. The tiny reversed stitch told on Edith's needlework as surely as a signature. It is very plain to me that he had it from our place, whether bought or given. By Mrs. Taylor? Graves asked. By someone, Miss Marple said. One must not leap to conclusions. People buy gifts in villages where they do not live, to feel they have known them longer than they have. She smiled, small and affectionate. In my experience, men who travel alone keep small, tidy things if they mean more than they look. He might have carried it for comfort, or as a message. A message? Lace and lavender, Miss Marple said gently. Some people speak in herbs and fabrics when they cannot speak in words. It is old-fashioned, but then we are very old-fashioned in our ways when we are most frightened. Graves considered this and tucked it away, as one might tuck a folded note into a coat pocket to reread when the day quiets. Tomorrow, he said, we'll speak to your vicar, to the postmaster, to anyone at the inn who saw him. We'll find where he walked. And you will find who watched him walk, said Miss Marple, and her eyes rested for a moment upon the faintly creased lace, remembering how hands that feared discovery pressed too hard and then pat too much. In that small memory, something almost like pity moved. Out on the lane, people's footsteps made the customary sounds of evening. Doors shut, kettles were filled, explanations were prepared for husbands and for conscience. A thrush sang with an eagerness that did not suit the hour. And Miss Marple, stepping into the hush of the garden, thought of how, in any flock, one bird sings early and another sings late. And from those deviations, one may tell a story. Who was woken? Who was disturbed? Who flew? She did not yet know whose song would falter when pressed. But she thought she knew already Which pair of hands had not been made for lace? Twilight in St. Mildred's was of the lingering kind that seemed reluctant to fold itself away. And the village, for all its excitement of the afternoon, moved toward evening in its accustomed rhythms. The little grocer's bell still jingled when the door opened. The faint scent of baking drifted from Mrs. Blount's kitchen, and the lane to the church was shadowed under its arch of elms. Yet for those who had been in Mrs. Wither's drawing room, the day's events clung to their thoughts with the quiet persistence of a burr on wool. Miss Marple, after taking her leave from Inspector Graves with her customary modest assurances, "Oh, I've only seen what anyone might if they looked," walked home along the lane toward her cottage. Her garden was waiting in its orderly late summer neatness. Roses pruned to a sensible height, the geraniums still holding their color, the neat beds of herbs that she tended with the same quiet precision she applied to people's affairs. She fed the cat, set the kettle on the hob, and took out her knitting, letting the steady rhythm of the needles help her sift the afternoon's impressions. It was not the first time she had encountered death at a social gathering, though she would never say such a thing aloud, lest someone mistake the observation for callousness. What was different was the presence of that sachet in the dead man's pocket. She had made many for the bazaar herself, though never in that particular chintz. Edith Taylor's backward corner stitch was unmistakable, a small, almost unnoticeable flaw, like the way a person might always glance left before answering a question, or tap their fingers in fours when thinking. She was not yet certain of its meaning, but she was quite sure it meant something. The following morning dawned with a milky haze over the meadows. Miss Marple was in her garden, deadheading the marigolds, when she heard the brisk tread of Constable Finch coming up the path. He greeted her with a deferential nod. He had long since learned that Miss Marple's apparent distractions were usually a sign she had noticed far more than anyone else. "Inspector Graves sent me along," he said. "He thought you might be able to tell me who in St. Mary Mead sold or gave away that lavender sachet." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I shouldn't think you'll find that in a list, Constable. Those things travel on their own, passed along, tucked into a drawer, given as thank-you gifts. But I will tell you this. Edith Taylor made that one, last December, for the church bazaar. We sold them for 6 pence each, though a few she gave away. I remember because she was very particular about people noticing the evenness of her stitches." "Do you know who she gave them to?" Miss Marple straightened up from the marigolds, brushing soil from her gloves. "Only a few. Mrs. Withers, Mrs. Pritchard, and a young man who came through the village just before Christmas. Said he was visiting his aunt in much bearing, though I never heard whose nephew he was. Tallish, dark hair, rather quick in his manner. Wore his coat collar up, as if he disliked being recognized. And he had a London accent. I recall him because Edith seemed put out after speaking with him." Finch's pencil was already scratching. "You think it could be the same man?" "I think it could be someone who knew him," she said. "Lavender is a curious thing to carry for months if you've no affection for the giver." Finch left with a promise to tell Graves, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting with the pleasant certainty that the thread of the matter, like her wool, would knot somewhere if she kept at it patiently. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves himself appeared, his expression thoughtful. "You said yesterday someone handled that lace roughly," he began without preamble. "I've been thinking on it. Finch went over the sill again this morning. Found a partial boot mark outside. Narrow tread worn at the heel. Not many men in these parts wear boots like that in summer." "And yet," Miss Marple said mildly, "Mr. Nash was wearing a pair yesterday." Brown leather, city made. He stood on the lawn, but he also came in to leave his stationery samples by the window. One might lean there without thinking. Graves considered her for a moment. You don't think he's the sort to break a man's neck? Oh, I make no judgment on that. Only that he strikes me as a man who likes to be noticed, not one who would creep. Graves smiled faintly. Creep, yes. That's the word for it. He glanced around her garden. I'll be speaking to Mrs. Taylor this afternoon. Would you say she's the sort to lie, if pressed? Miss Marple laid her knitting aside. Mrs. Taylor does not tell lies. She tells omissions. A neat distinction, but quite important. You will find her statements are accurate, up to a point. The point being where truth would trouble her. It was near noon when Miss Marple decided that a walk into the village might be useful. She took the path that ran along the hedgerows to the high street, stopping in at the grocer's for tea and the post office for stamps. In small places, errands are not only for purchasing, they are for observing. Outside the post office, she found Mrs. Pritchard, who seemed eager to speak but uncertain how to begin. Such a dreadful business yesterday, Miss Marple, she said, wringing her hands. I hardly slept a wink. I keep seeing that poor man at the window. Yes, it was most upsetting, Miss Marple agreed. You were in the room when Mrs. Taylor screamed? Oh, yes, right by the tea table. I turned around and, well, there he was. But you know, I thought I saw him earlier. Just after 2, walking along the lane by Mrs. Wither's hedge. He didn't seem to be coming to the front door, more like he was looking for something. Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. You're quite sure it was the same man? Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. Well, from the back, you understand. Same dark jacket, and he walked with a bit of a stoop. But when I mentioned it to Edith, she said I must have imagined it, as I was busy arranging the sandwiches. Miss Marple thanked her and went on her way, tucking that into her mental store. If Mrs. Pritchard was right, then the man had approached the Withers house quietly, perhaps to avoid being seen coming to the front. That might explain the scuff on the window frame. She passed the vicarage on her way home and, seeing Reverend Selby in the garden, paused to exchange greetings. The vicar, a kind but often absent-minded man, was trimming a rose bush. Terrible affair at Mrs. Withers's, I hear, he said. Graves stopped by this morning to ask about strangers in the parish. I couldn't think of any except the man who asked me, not a fortnight ago, about a Mrs. Elspeth Withers. Odd sort. Didn't give his name, but seemed anxious to know if she lived alone. And did you tell him? Of course not. Said he should ask her himself. But he didn't seem the type to knock at the door. Kept glancing over his shoulder. Miss Marple walked on, the pieces turning over in her mind. A man with reason to know whether Mrs. Withers lived alone, a sachet from Edith Taylor, a possible visit to St. Mary Mead months earlier. It was beginning to form a pattern, though the center of it remained elusive. That afternoon, the inspector called again. Mrs. Taylor admits she gave a sachet to a man last December, but claims she never learned his name. Says he seemed in a hurry, bought it, and went on his way. Doesn't remember seeing him again. And do you believe her? Graves frowned. I believe she saw more of him than she says. But until I can prove otherwise... He left the sentence unfinished. The coroner says the man's neck was broken cleanly, quick, deliberate, and from behind. No defensive wounds. Either he knew his attacker or was caught entirely off guard. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. There are not many in this village who could do such a thing quietly, without attracting notice. Strength is one thing, Calm is another. They spoke a while longer, and when Graves left, Miss Marple sat down once more to her knitting. Her mind was not on the pattern, but on the hands that had crushed and smoothed the lace. Not housewifely hands, she had said. And yet, they were hands that had reason to be near the window, and the calm to do what was necessary without a ripple of disturbance. She thought again of Mrs. Pritchard's glimpse along the hedge, of the vicar's cautious visitor, of Edith Taylor's habit of omission. The pattern was there, and if she could only find the missing stitch, the whole design would be clear. And when she did, she thought, it would be as delicate and as strong as lace. The following day dawned brighter, with the haze burnt off by a mild breeze, and St. Mildred's returned outwardly to its placid routine. Yet beneath the calm surface, there was a hum of subdued tension. The talk in the grocer's was not of the price of eggs, but of the stranger in Mrs. Withers's drawing room. In the post office queue, heads bent together in whispered speculation. People avoided appearing too curious, which in a small village often results in being twice as much so. Miss Marple, sitting in her parlor with her knitting, had already noted that gossip had begun to shape itself into firm opinion. Dangerous territory, for once an idea sets in firmly, it tends to resist dislodging, even with the facts. The name most often whispered was that of Mr. Clement Nash, the stationer's representative. His sudden appearance at the tea, his city boots, and the easy way he had wandered about the Withers garden made him a convenient candidate. Graves had not said as much, but Miss Marple was quite sure the inspector had heard the same rumor. Around mid-morning, Constable Finch came to her gate again, more hesitant this time. "Inspector Graves thought you might like to join us at Mrs. Withers's," he said. "We're asking the guests to walk us through their movements again. He says you see things he doesn't." It was not an invitation Miss Marple would refuse. They found Mrs. Withers in her morning room, composed but weary. She greeted them with polite reserve, and Graves explained they would like to hear again from those present at the tea in the same rooms and positions as before. One by one they recounted their movements. Mrs. Hartley Pease, whose manner always suggested she was conducting an assembly, spoke crisply of standing by the tea table until Edith's cry. Mrs. Blount claimed she had been in earnest conversation about the church roof with Mr. Rudge on the lawn. Mrs. Pritchard, nervous as a bird, repeated her story about seeing a man along the hedge, adding that she could not swear to it under oath, but felt sure it had been the dead man. Mr. Nash was urbane and confident, explaining that he had stepped inside briefly to leave his sample case on the side table near the window, and had then been drawn back outside by the sight of Mrs. Withers's roses. Graves asked him whether he had touched the curtain. "Only brushed against it," Nash said lightly. "Delicate fabric, that. I wouldn't dare meddle with it." Miss Marple watched him with mild interest. His hands, she noticed, were smooth, the nails well kept. No signs of the habitual handling of garden tools or rough fabrics. Yet there was a faint abrasion on the knuckle of his right hand, a mark that could have come from any number of things. But in her mind, it lodged as another stitch in her growing pattern. Then came Edith Taylor's turn. She walked into the drawing room, her reticule in hand, and stood as if at a witness box. "As I have said before, I came from the pantry to fetch my jam for the tea table," she said. "I passed through the hall, turned into the drawing room, and saw the man by the window. I did not go close. I called out, and others came." "You had not seen him earlier in the afternoon?" Graves asked. "No," said Edith flatly. Miss Marple, from her chair near the fireplace, let her eyes rest on Edith's hands. They were capable hands, steady, precise, the hands of a woman used to sewing fine hems and rolling pastry to an exact thickness. But the fingertips bore faint marks, as though from gripping something firmer than needle and thread. Graves, perhaps prompted by her glance, said casually, "You've no idea how he came to have one of your lavender sachets?" Edith's eyes flickered only for an instant. "I told you, Inspector. I sell them at the bazaar. Anyone might have bought one." When the questioning was over, the party broke apart, some to the garden, others to the hallway. Graves lingered, waiting until Mrs. Withers was out of earshot. "Well?" he asked Miss Marple quietly. "She is telling the truth," Miss Marple said, "and also not telling it. She did not see him earlier in the afternoon, or so she chooses to define see." "You think she saw him before the tea?" "I think she knew he would be there." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is a different sort of seeing." Graves sighed. "You make it sound as though everyone is lying, one way or another." "Oh, Inspector, in a village everyone lies a little. They call it privacy." As they left Mrs. Withers's, Miss Marple noticed something she had missed before. Just inside the garden gate, the earth was scuffed, as though someone had paused there, perhaps uncertain whether to enter. Among the scuff marks was a cigarette butt. Cheap, strong tobacco, not the sort favored by the genteel smokers of St. Mildred's. She filed it away in her mind without comment. That afternoon, she took her customary seat by the window of her parlor, from which she could see the lane. She was rewarded, just before 4, by the sight of Edith Taylor walking past, her face set in its usual determined lines. What caught Miss Marple's attention was the direction she took, toward the old footpath that led circuitously to the disused mill on the edge of the parish. It was not a way one took without purpose. Without haste, Miss Marple fetched her hat and followed, keeping a discreet distance. Edith walked briskly, her eyes forward, until she reached the mill. There she paused, glanced around, and bent to retrieve something from behind a loose board in the side wall. It was small, dark, and she slipped it quickly into her reticule before turning back. Miss Marple did not follow her home. There was no need. The important thing was the fact of the errand, not the object itself. At least, not yet. That evening, Graves came to call, bringing news. "We've identified the man," he said. "Name of Leonard Price. Lodged in Much Bearing for a few days. No known occupation, bit of a drifter. Had a record in London some years back for theft, but nothing violent." "People change," Miss Marple murmured, pouring tea. He'd been making inquiries about Mrs. Withers, through the vicar, at the inn, and at the post office. Seems he claimed she was a distant cousin. No proof of that, of course. But here's the interesting thing. Mrs. Withers says she's never heard of him. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And yet he came straight to her house, or at least to her window. One might think he expected either to be welcomed or to find something. Graves leaned back. "We also traced that ticket he had. He did come from St. Mary Mead the morning of the murder, which makes your lavender sachet connection more interesting." "Or more dangerous," Miss Marple said gently. "If someone in St. Mary Mead gave it to him, that someone might have had a reason for wanting him silenced before he could speak." Graves regarded her with a half-smile. "You think the motive isn't here in St. Mildred's at all?" "Oh, it may be both here and there," she replied. "Crimes are like ivy. They root in more than one place." As the inspector took his leave, Miss Marple's mind returned to Edith Taylor at the mill. She had no proof yet, only the quiet certainty that Edith was the link between Leonard Price's presence in St. Mildred's and his sudden, silent death. What she had hidden might be the missing piece, or another layer of deception. The next morning promised to be clear again, and Miss Marple resolved to speak with an old acquaintance in St. Mary Mead, who had once had dealings with a certain Leonard Price. If she could learn what had brought him back into their orbit, the lace curtain might yet reveal the ghostly hand that had brushed it. And when it did, she suspected, the picture it framed would not be at all what the village imagined. Morning in St. Mildred's arrived crisp and untroubled, as if the village itself had no memory of the man found dead in Mrs. Withers's drawing room. The milk was delivered, shop shutters were propped open, and Mrs. Hartley Pease was already walking her terrier along the high street with the air of one who must be seen to keep her routines intact. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of letting the matter rest in the hands of routine. After an early breakfast, she caught the first bus to St. Mary Mead, knitting in her lap and eyes idly roving over the hedgerows as though her mind were on nothing more pressing than whether the Michaelmas daisies would bloom early. In truth, her purpose was quite definite. There were two people in St. Mary Mead whose recollections might prove useful. Mr. Giles Parmenter, a retired solicitor who remembered every petty legal tangle of the last 30 years, and Mrs. Clarice Bolt, who had a memory for faces unmatched by any ledger or census. Her first stop was the small cottage where Mrs. Bolt lived with her widowed sister. Mrs. Bolt was weeding her front garden, her straw hat askew. "Leonard Price?" she said, when Miss Marple brought up the name in her gentle, meandering fashion. "Oh, I know who you mean. Came through here just before Christmas, he did. Dark hair, quick eyes, and a bit too sure of himself. Said he was looking for an aunt and much bearing. I remember because he stopped at the church hall during the bazaar, bought one of Edith Taylor's lavender sachets. I thought at the time he was more interested in who was in the room than in the wares for sale." "Did he speak to anyone in particular?" Miss Marple asked. "Well, he had a few words with Edith, and then with young George Larkin, Miss Larkin's nephew from London. That one's a shifty sort, if you ask me. Doesn't come down often, but when he does, he's always in some sort of scrape." Miss Marple thanked her, filed away the information, and made her way to Mr. Parmenter's neat little house near the green. The retired solicitor received her in his study, which smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and ink. When she mentioned Leonard Price, his brows rose. "I remember him well enough," Parmenter said. "He came to me in '38, seeking advice about an inheritance. Claimed his mother had been left something by a cousin in St. Mildred's, a sum in the bank and some property. Trouble was, he had no papers to prove it, only a story. I told him without documentation, he hadn't a case." "And was there such a cousin?" "Possibly. Elspeth Withers's late husband had a cousin who went to London in the 20s. No children, no close ties. If there was money, it might have been left to Elspeth. That would explain Price's interest, if he thought she owed him something." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap as she listened. A supposed claim on Mrs. Withers's inheritance that could bring a man uninvited to her window. And if Edith Taylor had met him before, given him that sachet, perhaps she had been his link to the village all along. By noon, she was back in St. Mildred's, just in time to see Inspector Graves coming down the lane from Mrs. Withers's house. He looked more grim than usual. "We found something," he said without preamble. Behind the old mill, tucked in the boards, a small cloth wallet. Inside were 2 letters addressed to Leonard Price, one from a solicitor in London, the other unsigned. The unsigned one says only, "Thursday, 3 o'clock. She will be alone. The window will be open." "And the wallet was hidden where Edith Taylor was seen yesterday," Miss Marple said mildly. Graves's eyes narrowed. "So Finch tells me. You saw her there yourself?" "I did." She removed something from behind the boards. What you found may be what she left behind, or not. It's possible she took one thing and hid another. They walked slowly toward the green, their steps unhurried, as if discussing nothing more urgent than the weather. Graves said, "If Edith arranged to meet Price, why would she kill him?" "There are many reasons one might silence a man," Miss Marple replied. "Debt, fear, loyalty to another. Or perhaps she feared what he would say to Mrs. Withers. She is devoted to Mrs. Withers in her own way, very protective of her position in that household." Graves stopped outside the post office. "We'll bring her in for questioning this afternoon. If she's hiding something, better to have it out." Miss Marple did not contradict him, but she knew Edith Taylor would not be easily cornered. Her stubborn sense of rightness would make her cling to a version of events that served her purpose, even if it skirted the whole truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Pritchard, under the pretext of returning a borrowed recipe. Mrs. Pritchard, relieved to have company, poured tea and soon began talking about the day of the murder again. "It keeps running through my head," she said. "Just before Edith screamed, I was in the garden looking toward the bay window. I thought I saw someone move the curtain from inside. Not much, just enough to look out. But it wasn't Mrs. Withers, and it didn't look like Edith either. Taller, I think." Miss Marple's mind went at once to Mr. Nash. He had been inside briefly, he claimed, to leave his samples. Had he in fact been at the window, watching for someone? By the time she returned home, her thoughts had arranged themselves into a more definite shape. If Price had come to claim something from Mrs. Withers, money, perhaps, or information, then someone had lured him to the house at a time when they could intercept him. The letter found in the mill made it clear the meeting was planned. Edith might have been the one to arrange it. But that did not mean she had delivered the fatal blow. Just after tea, a knock came at her door. It was Graves again, looking faintly frustrated. "Edith admits she met Price before," he said. "Says he came to her in December, claimed he was a cousin of Mrs. Withers and wanted to surprise her. She swears she didn't believe him, but he was polite, and she gave him a sachet because he admired the lavender. Yesterday, she says, she saw him from the garden just before the tea, but by the time she went into the drawing room, he was already dead." "And the wallet in the mill?" "She denies knowing anything about it." Graves rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not enough to hold her." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and said gently, "Sometimes, Inspector, it is not the one who arranged the meeting who delivers the blow, but the one who arrives knowing the meeting will happen. Ask yourself, who else knew that window would be open?" Graves's eyes sharpened. "Lily raised it at 2. Mrs. Withers asked her to. Anyone in the garden after that could have noticed." "And who," Miss Marple added, "had a reason to fear what Price might reveal, and the ability to act swiftly without alarming a room full of ladies?" Graves did not answer, but she saw the thought settle in his mind. The list of such people was shorter than the list of those who had gossiped about Mr. Nash's boots. When he left, Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her knitting in her lap, and considered the lace curtain again in her mind's eye. The faint crease, the coarse thread caught at the hem. Not Edith's doing, she thought now, but someone else's. Someone who had leaned in through that open sash or stood too close inside, pressing against the fabric just before stepping away. It was almost time, she knew, to test her theory, not by accusation, but by the sort of gentle provocation that loosens a person's composure. A small remark, an innocent observation, and the guilty often supply the rest themselves. In the meantime, she would let the village go on whispering about Edith Taylor. Whispers are useful. They draw attention in one direction, while the truth comes quietly from another. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, would be waiting when it did. The next morning brought a fine, sharp light that made every edge in St. Mildred's seem cleaner, and every color a little truer. The roses outside Miss Marple's window looked freshly painted, and the shadows under the eaves were so crisp they might have been drawn with a ruler. Such clarity in the air, Miss Marple reflected as she buttered her toast, often brought clarity in thought, provided one allowed the mind to wander without pressing it too hard. She had decided that today would be a day for listening rather than acting. Graves would, she knew, be quietly pursuing the obvious path. Speaking again to Edith Taylor, checking Leonard Price's movements between St. Mary Mead and St. Mildred's, and questioning Lily about anything she might have seen when she opened the window. Miss Marple's path was subtler. She meant to see what the village itself was ready to give away, now that the first shock had softened into curiosity. Her first call was at the small tea shop on the High Street, where Mrs. Larch ran her counter with the brisk cheer of one who knows every regular's preferred bun. This morning, there were two ladies in the corner, Mrs. Blount and Miss Larkins, leaning over their teacups in the universal posture of gossip. Miss Marple took a table just near enough that her polite greetings might be followed by an easy conversation. It was Miss Larkins who could not resist speaking first. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple, what sort of man comes all the way here just to stand in someone's drawing room and die? It's unnatural." "And very inconvenient for Mrs. Withers," Mrs. Blount added, in the middle of her lace and lavender tea. "Though I did hear," she lowered her voice, "that he'd been seen speaking to Mr. Nash earlier in the week. At the post office, of all places." "Indeed?" Miss Marple said mildly, as if such a thing could scarcely matter. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Blount went on. "Lily told Mrs. Pritchard, and Mrs. Pritchard told me. Said Nash looked as though he didn't want to be noticed." Miss Larkins sniffed. "I should think not, if they were arranging anything untoward." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile and sipped her tea, as if the matter were a pleasant abstraction. But inside, the information lodged firmly. If Nash had spoken to Price before the day of the murder, then he could not claim ignorance of the man's identity or purpose. From the tea shop, Miss Marple took the longer way round the village, passing the lane that led to the old mill. A man was there ahead of her. Harold Rudge, the horticultural enthusiast, kneeling by the hedge with a small trowel, apparently investigating a patch of soil. "Good morning, Mr. Rudge," she called pleasantly. "Your delphiniums must be nearly at their peak now." He started slightly, looked up, and then gave a rather fixed smile. Yes, they're coming along well. Just checking the ground here. It's poor soil, full of rubble." She glanced at the disturbed earth. "I imagine there's all sorts of odds and ends hidden near the mill." He laughed, too quickly. "Old nails, bits of glass. Not worth the trouble." Then, with a muttered excuse, he gathered his tools and walked away toward the green. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression as mild as ever. But she could not help thinking of the small wallet Graves had found behind the mill boards, and how interesting it was that someone else should be nosing about there so soon afterward. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Graves called at her cottage. He looked thoughtful rather than triumphant. "We've confirmed Price arrived in much bearing 3 days before the murder," he said. "Stayed at the Crown, spent some time in St. Mildred's. People remember seeing him, but no one claims to know what he was doing." "And Mr. Nash?" Graves gave a short laugh. "Nash admits he spoke to Price briefly, says Price asked him where Mrs. Withers lived, and he gave vague directions. Claims he thought Price was selling something. Convenient story, that." Miss Marple nodded, especially as Nash was in a position to know when Mrs. Withers would be hosting her tea. Invitations were discussed at the post office, I imagine. Exactly. He delivers there often enough. Graves rubbed his chin. Still, knowing Price was in the village doesn't mean Nash killed him. What would be his motive? That, Miss Marple said gently, is what we must discover. Sometimes, Inspector, a person's motive is not to gain something, but to prevent losing it. A reputation, for instance, or a secret. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Lily, Mrs. Withers's maid, looking pale and uncertain. I thought I ought to tell you, Miss Marple. Yesterday, after I opened the window, I saw Mr. Rudge near the side gate. He said he was looking for Mrs. Withers, but she was in the kitchen at the time. He seemed anxious. I didn't think anything of it until now. Miss Marple thanked her warmly and sent her off with a scone for her trouble. When Graves had gone too, Miss Marple sat for a long while with her knitting untouched, thinking of Rudge's sudden appearance at the mill that morning and his proximity to the garden on the day of the murder. The next day, she made another quiet round of visits. At the post office, she asked casually whether Mr. Nash had sent any letters that week. The postmistress, never averse to a little chat, told her he had posted one the day before the murder, addressed to a firm in London. She had no idea of its contents, of course, but she remembered he seemed distracted, almost flustered. At Mrs. Pritchard's, Miss Marple inquired after her health and, in the course of conversation, steered things back to the sighting along the hedge. Mrs. Pritchard was firm. She had seen a man in a dark jacket heading toward the bay window from the side of the house shortly before Edith screamed. But when Miss Marple asked if she had noticed anything about his walk, Mrs. Pritchard hesitated. Come to think of it, he limped a little, just the one step shorter than the other. That evening, Miss Marple took down a notebook from her desk and wrote out 3 names: Clement Nash, Harold Rudge, Edith Taylor. Beneath each, she jotted the threads that bound them to Leonard Price: Nash's conversation at the post office, Rudge's presence near the side gate and at the mill, Edith's prior acquaintance, and the sachet. All 3 could have known the window would be open. All 3 had reason to avoid open discussion of their link to Price. Yet, in her mind's eye, she kept returning to the lace curtain, the coarse fiber caught in its hem, the crease from an impatient hand. She thought of Nash's smooth hands, Edith's careful ones, Rudge's gardener's grip, and she thought of the cigarette butt outside the gate with its strong, cheap tobacco. The picture was almost complete. But there was still the matter of testing the reaction she sought, the tiny crack in composure that would tell her she was right. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. The parish council was meeting in the village hall the next evening to discuss repairs to the church roof, and all 3 of her names were likely to be there. Miss Marple attended as she always did, sitting in the second row with her knitting, her eyes lowered, but her ears and her mind alert. When the meeting broke for tea, she positioned herself near the table where the cups were set out, and when Harold Rudge came past, she remarked in her mildest voice, "It's a dreadful thing about that man by Mrs. Withers's window. One wonders if he saw something he oughtn't. Perhaps someone hiding something at the old mill." She saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the brief tightening of the jaw before he smoothed it away with a chuckle. "Old place is full of rubbish," he said, pouring his tea. "Could be anything there." Miss Marple only smiled and offered him a plate of biscuits. She had her reaction. Now she only needed to see how it fitted with the rest of the pattern. By the time she walked home, under the clear, starry sky, her mind was as crisp as the night air. The lace curtain story was nearly told. And when it was, she suspected the ghost it had framed would turn out to be a very solid, very human hand indeed. The morning after the parish council meeting found Miss Marple in her garden, trimming the lavender hedge with small, precise snips. The air was still and carried the faint perfume of the blossoms. As she worked, she replayed the image of Harold Rudge's face when she had mentioned the old mill. It had been fleeting. A narrowing of the eyes, a quick calculation, but she had seen it. Such moments were like the twitch of a curtain in a still room. They told you someone was inside. By mid-morning, she decided the time had come to move the matter forward. Not in a grand leap, no, that would startle her quarry, but by narrowing the path until only one direction remained. For that, she needed Graves. She sent a brief note by Lily, couched as an invitation for tea, knowing that the inspector would not waste the opportunity for a private word away from official ears. Graves arrived just before 11, looking faintly amused. "Your tea is becoming something of an interrogation chamber, Miss Marple," he said, settling into the chair opposite her. "I prefer to think of it as a place where the truth feels comfortable enough to visit," she replied, pouring for him. "Inspector, I believe Mr. Rudge has been more closely involved with Leonard Price than he has admitted. His manner last night told me as much. But to prove it, we must understand what exactly Price had that could alarm him." Graves frowned into his cup. "We've been through Price's few belongings. Nothing of obvious value. The letters from London suggest he was chasing money, but they don't name any names beyond Mrs. Withers. If Rudge was involved, it must be through her. Or through something in her possession," Miss Marple said. "Something Price expected to find when he came to the house. Do you recall the scuff on the sill and the droplet ring round the vase? I think Price never entered by the door at all. He came to the window, perhaps on signal, and that is where he met his death." Graves set down his cup. Then whoever killed him was already inside. "Precisely. And to do such a thing without drawing notice from a room full of ladies takes both opportunity and composure. A gardener accustomed to moving quietly about the grounds might have both, particularly if his presence indoors was not unexpected." The inspector leaned back. "You're suggesting Rudge went in under some pretext, met Price at the window, and killed him before the others saw." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "It would explain the coarse fiber on the lace, more likely from gardening clothes than city tailoring. And the limp Mrs. Pritchard noticed fits Rudge, who favors his left leg after a fall from a ladder some years ago." Graves was silent for a moment. "If that's true, we still need the why." "I think," she said, "we might find our answer in Mrs. Withers's late husband's affairs. Did he have anything worth quarreling over? Land, perhaps, or valuables not listed in probate?" "We can look into it," Graves said slowly. "If Rudge thought Price had a claim, or feared that he would discover something Rudge had taken for himself." Miss Marple finished. After Graves left, Miss Marple walked to the high street. She stopped at the post office to collect a parcel and exchanged a few words with the postmistress, who let slip that Rudge had sent a registered packet to London not a week before the murder. It was addressed to a jeweler. The postmistress, in the way of those entrusted with village correspondence, noted that the envelope had been unusually heavy for its size. From there, Miss Marple strolled to Mrs. Pritchard's. She found her neighbor in the garden and steered their chat toward old village matters. "Do you recall," Miss Marple asked, "if Mr. Withers had any fine pieces? Silver, perhaps, or jewelry?" Mrs. Pritchard brightened. Oh yes, he had a gold pocket watch, very fine, and a little collection of brooches and stick pins. I remember because they were shown at the church fete once, in the display of treasures from local homes. And after his death, I suppose Mrs. Withers kept them, though I never saw them again. Miss Marple's eyes softened with thanks, though her mind had already moved on. If those pieces had vanished quietly, they might have been in Rudge's keeping or already sold. Price, learning of them from some source, could have come to St. Mildred's to demand his share or to use his knowledge for leverage. That afternoon, she took a slow walk past the Withers garden. Rudge was there, pruning the rose arch, his limp more pronounced when he thought no one was watching. She paused at the gate. "Such a picture of industry, Mr. Rudge," she said pleasantly. He straightened, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Gotta keep ahead of the weeds, Miss Marple. I imagine a gardener sees all sorts of comings and goings," she said. "Why, you'd have noticed if a stranger approached this house from the side." Rudge shrugged. "Can't say I did." Miss Marple tilted her head, the picture of harmlessness. "Funny, though. Mrs. Pritchard swears she saw a man in a dark jacket by the hedge that day. Limped a little, she says." For the briefest instant, the smile faltered. "Plenty of men limp," he said, turning back to his pruning. "Of course," she agreed sweetly. "Still, it would be awkward to be mistaken for the wrong man at the wrong time." She left him then, but the exchange had confirmed more than any confession could. He was guarding something he could not afford to have connected to Price. That evening, she considered how best to draw him out. A direct accusation would harden him. A subtle reminder that others might, already suspect, could unsettle him enough to act. And when a guilty person acts, they often leave behind the one piece of proof you need. The next morning, she sent Lily with a note to Mrs. Withers, saying she had found an old church fete program that might interest her, one listing the treasures from local homes. She knew the mention of it would ripple through the household, reaching Rudge by some means or other. If he had taken any of those treasures, the knowledge that they might be remembered could stir him into dangerous movement. Sure enough, that afternoon, Graves appeared at her door with fresh news. "We've had a report from the Much-Bearing police," he said. "A jeweler there bought a gold pocket watch last week from a man matching Rudge's description. Inscription inside, 'To E. Withers, with love.'" Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of nods. "Then I think, Inspector, we are very close. Price must have known of the watch and come to claim his connection to it. Whether he had any legal right hardly matters. What matters is that Rudge feared he might persuade Mrs. Withers, or the authorities, that the watch had been misappropriated. The meeting at the window was to silence him before he could speak." Graves's eyes lit with the satisfaction of a puzzle fitting into place. "If we can tie the watch to Rudge, and Rudge to Price at that window, you will have your case," Miss Marple said. "And you will find that the lace curtain, so delicate and innocent, has caught more than one ghostly thread in its time." She sat back, her hands folded over her knitting, knowing that the final step would be to watch how Rudge behaved now that the noose was, invisibly, around his neck. And she was quite prepared to give it the lightest of tugs at just the right moment. The following day began with a stillness that seemed to settle over St. Mildred's like a held breath. The air was warm, the sun high, but softened by a faint veil of cloud. Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk in the parlor, a letter half written before her. She was not in any particular hurry to finish it. Her mind was engaged elsewhere, turning over the details of Harold Rudge's predicament and the precise way in which Leonard Price had met his end. The pattern was clear enough now. Rudge had taken something, most likely the gold watch, perhaps more. And Price had come to St. Mildred's to confront him, or at least to use what he knew to his advantage. The letter found behind the old mill was a lure, promising a meeting through the open window at Mrs. Withers's tea. But it had been Rudge who made sure that meeting would be fatal. Yet Miss Marple knew that patterns, while satisfying to the mind, were useless in court without proof. And proof, with a man like Rudge, would not be handed over willingly. Around 11, Inspector Graves arrived, his step purposeful. "We've confirmed the sale of the watch," he said without preamble. The jeweler identified Rudge without hesitation. "We've also found that Price was asking after Mrs. Withers's late husband's possessions, showing a photograph of that watch, no less. My guess is someone in St. Mary Mead told him about it." Miss Marple nodded. "It could have been mentioned at the bazaar last December when Price was there. Edith Taylor, perhaps, though she may not have realized what she was giving away." Graves sat heavily. "The problem is, Price's death looks like a meeting gone wrong. Without a witness, it's just conjecture that Rudge killed him deliberately." Miss Marple gave him a bright, almost innocent smile. "Then perhaps we must let Mr. Rudge supply the witness for us." That afternoon, Miss Marple put her plan in motion. She walked to Mrs. Withers's, ostensibly to bring her a pot of quince jelly. As she passed through the garden, she saw Rudge kneeling by the herb bed, his limp noticeable even in that bent position. "Good day, Mr. Rudge," she said warmly. "I was just speaking to Inspector Graves this morning about the lace curtain in your mistress's drawing room. Such a shame, he says, that they haven't yet found the man's killer, though of course they have the most extraordinary clue now. Something to do with a footprint and a fiber in the curtain hem." Rudge straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Fiber?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Apparently it's quite distinctive, came from rough, outdoor clothing. I dare say the inspector will explain it all to you soon enough." She left him with that seed planted, knowing that a guilty man who believed incriminating evidence existed would be compelled to act, either to destroy it or to misdirect suspicion. By early evening, the bait had taken. Graves, waiting with Finch in the lane beyond Mrs. Withers's, saw Rudge slip quietly out of the garden and make his way toward the old mill. They followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Inside the mill, Rudge went to the same loose board where the wallet had been found. He knelt, pulling out a small tin box, and began removing its contents. A length of coarse cloth torn from a jacket sleeve, a pair of worn gloves, and a packet of cigarettes identical to the butt found by the gate. He stuffed these into a canvas bag, glancing about nervously. That was when Graves stepped into the doorway. "Evening, Rudge." Rudge froze, the bag halfway closed. "Inspector, I was just clearing rubbish." Graves's voice was calm, but there was iron in it. "Rubbish that happens to match fibers found on a murdered man and a cigarette left at the scene. Care to explain?" The color drained from Rudge's face. "I don't know anything about—" Miss Marple's voice came from the doorway behind him, light as ever. "Oh, I think you do, Mr. Rudge. You met Leonard Price at the bay window that day. You were afraid of what he'd tell Mrs. Withers about the watch, and perhaps other things that had passed quietly into your keeping. You intended to frighten him off, but it takes more strength than you realize to pull a man back through a window. His neck broke, and you had to make it look as if he'd come there alone and collapsed." Rudge's hands tightened on the bag. "You can't prove—" Graves stepped forward. We can prove the watch was stolen. We can prove Price was lured to the house. And now we can put you at that window, wearing clothes that match the fiber caught in the lace. That's enough to start." Rudge looked between them, the fight going out of his shoulders. "He would have ruined me," he said finally. "Mrs. Withers would have turned me out, and everyone in the village would have known. I only meant to push him away." "And so you did," Miss Marple said gently, "but in the wrong direction." Graves took him into custody without further struggle. The bag was sealed as evidence, the coarse cloth and gloves inside more damning than any confession. Later, as dusk settled over the village, Graves walked Miss Marple back toward her gate. "I'll never understand how you got him to that mill tonight." She smiled. "People with secrets are like magpies. They can't resist returning to the place where they've hidden something, especially if they think someone else may find it first. All it needed was the right hint in the right ear." He gave a short laugh. "I'll have to remember that." The following morning, the news moved through St. Mildred's in its usual fashion, passed over garden walls, exchanged at the grocer's, whispered in the post office queue. By noon, it was accepted as fact that Harold Rudge had been the ghost in the lace curtain, and that Miss Marple, as always, had somehow known from the start. Mrs. Withers sent for her that afternoon, offering tea and a rather tremulous thank you. "I don't know how to express my gratitude, Miss Marple. To think, all this time, under my own roof." Miss Marple patted her hand. "We never truly know what happens under our own roofs, Mrs. Withers. Not until something shakes the dust from the rafters. But I'm glad you're safe from further unpleasantness." On her way home, Miss Marple paused in the lane to look back at the house. The bay window was open again, the lace curtain stirring lightly in the breeze. From this distance, it seemed almost as if a shadow moved behind it, but she knew it was only the play of light. Still, she thought, the curtain had framed more than just the afternoon sun. It had framed greed, fear, and the fatal moment when both met in silence. And like all such stories, it would linger in the village's memory long after the lace itself had worn thin. 2 days after Harold Rudge had been taken away, St. Mildred's looked, on the surface, exactly as it had before. The shop doors stood open, children played marbles in the lane, and Mrs. Hartley Pease was, once again discussing the church roof repairs with all the solemnity of a stateswoman. But there was a new current under the village calm, a carefulness in conversation, as though each person weighed their words before speaking them. The knowledge that a murderer had walked among them for months, tending roses and nodding politely, had lodged in everyone's minds like a pebble in a shoe. Miss Marple found herself the object of more than the usual number of neighborly calls. Some came with genuine gratitude, others with the curiosity of those who want to hear the story from the source. She received them all with her usual mild courtesy, listening more than she spoke. In her experience, once the solution was public, people were quick to fit themselves into it, claiming to have suspected all along or to have noticed something they never truly had. On the third morning, Inspector Graves called in person. He looked less tired than he had during the investigation, but there was still a certain reserve in his manner. "The magistrate's remand hearing went as expected," he said. "Rudge didn't contest it. His solicitor says he'll likely plead to manslaughter, but the theft of the watch and the other items will weigh against him." "And Mrs. Withers?" Miss Marple asked, pouring the tea. Shaken, but putting on a brave face. "She's kept Lily on, which is wise. Having someone in the house she can trust. Edith Taylor, on the other hand, is avoiding all company. I think she feels guilty for having spoken to Price back in December, even if she didn't understand the significance." Miss Marple nodded. Guilt can be a stubborn weed. It grows even in soil where no seed was planted. Graves sipped his tea in companionable silence for a moment, then said, "There's one thing I've been meaning to ask you. When did you first think it was Rudge?" She smiled faintly. "When Mrs. Pritchard mentioned the limp. There are not many men in St. Mildred's with that particular gait. It matched the cigarette outside the gate. Coarse tobacco, the sort a man smokes when he works outdoors and spends little on himself. And the fiber on the lace was far too rough to belong to Mr. Nash's city suit." "But you didn't tell me outright." "I've learned, Inspector, that telling too soon can close doors instead of opening them. It's better to let suspicion ripen until the person you suspect tries to pluck it away themselves. Then you have the proof you need." Graves chuckled quietly. "You make it sound as simple as pruning a hedge." "It is, in essence. But you must know the plant you're pruning." After he left, Miss Marple spent a quiet afternoon in her garden, reflecting on the threads of the case. Leonard Price had not been an innocent man. He had come to St. Mildred's intending to profit from what he knew. But greed had met greed at the open window, and one life had ended while another was forever altered. That evening, she took a walk through the village. The bay window of Mrs. Withers's house was closed now, the lace curtain hanging still. Lily was sweeping the front path. She looked up and smiled shyly at Miss Marple. "It's strange," she said. "Sometimes I think I hear someone in the drawing room, and then I remember—" Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "It will pass, my dear. Houses remember things for a while, but they settle down, just as people do." Further along the lane, she encountered Mrs. Pritchard, who was carrying a basket of eggs from her sister's farm. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been anxious throughout the whole business, now spoke with the calm of one whose fears had been confirmed and contained. "I knew I saw someone by that hedge," she said. "Of course, I didn't know it was Mr. Rudge, but still." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "It is always worth paying attention to the small things one sees without meaning to." By the time she returned home, the lamps were being lit in cottage windows, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from early autumn fires. She set her knitting in her lap and allowed her mind to wander, not to the crime itself, but to the way it had unfolded in the life of the village. The lace and lavender tea would be held again next year, she supposed, though perhaps without the same carefree air. And the lace curtain, no doubt freshly laundered, would once more flutter in the summer breeze. Its faint crease smoothed away, the coarse fiber long since brushed out. A few days later, she received a letter from St. Mary Mead. It was from Mrs. Clarice Bolt, thanking her for a small packet of seeds Miss Marple had sent, and adding a postscript. "By the way, you were quite right." Leonard Price had been asking about jewelry. He spoke to my sister about a gold watch and some brooches. She thought he was just making conversation. Miss Marple folded the letter with a small nod. It was satisfying to see even the smallest piece fall into place, though the larger picture was already complete. On Sunday, she attended church in St. Mildred's. The congregation was unusually attentive to the sermon, perhaps because the vicar's theme was, "What is done in secret shall be brought to light." She could not help noticing the sideways glances exchanged between parishioners, the silent acknowledgments of all they had lived through together in recent weeks. After the service, she walked home with Mrs. Withers, who seemed relieved to have company. "I keep wondering," Mrs. Withers said softly, "if there was anything I might have done differently. If I'd spoken to Leonard Price myself, perhaps I could have avoided all this." Miss Marple shook her head. My dear Mrs. Withers, people's actions are their own. Mr. Rudge made his choice long before that day. You were only the stage upon which the scene was played. The following week, with the inquest concluded and the matter formally closed, the village began to relax. Mr. Nash's sales calls were once again about paper stock and not peppered with sidewise glances. Edith Taylor resumed her place at the church sewing circle, though she worked in silence more often than before. Even Mrs. Hartley Pease found a new topic to dominate conversation: the forthcoming harvest supper. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her quiet rhythms, tending her garden, writing letters, and listening, always listening, to the small currents of village life. The case of the ghost in the lace curtain was finished, but human nature, she knew, never rested. There would always be another pattern to notice, another thread to follow. One warm afternoon, as she sat in her parlor with the window open to the scent of roses, she thought again of Leonard Price's last moments, of how he must have approached the open sash, thinking it an invitation, and how quickly the scene had turned. The lace had stirred, the shadows had shifted, and in an instant the meeting had become a fatal one. It was, she reflected, a reminder that the most dangerous traps are not the ones that look threatening, but the ones that look inviting. And perhaps that was why she had always found lace so interesting. Beautiful to the eye, delicate to the touch, but made strong by the interlocking of many small threads, just like the truths she had spent her life untangling. She smiled to herself, picked up her knitting, and let the needles click softly in the stillness. Outside, a light breeze moved the flowers, and somewhere down the lane a curtain stirred in an open window. This time it was only the wind, but Miss Marple, as ever, noticed it all the same. A week later, St. Mildred's had resumed almost its full measure of calm, though the events surrounding Harold Rudge were still spoken of in corners, in lowered voices, and often with a glance over the shoulder. The summer had settled into that gentle decline before autumn, when the days were warm, but the evenings came sooner, and the air carried a faint coolness beneath the sun. The hedgerows hung heavy with berries, the church bells rang with their familiar steadiness, and the lace and lavender tea had already begun to be recast in memory, some recounting it as a shocking tragedy, others as a village curiosity that had somehow been bound to happen. Miss Marple's own days returned to their quiet habits: mornings in the garden, afternoons with her knitting or correspondence, and walks in the evening to watch the play of light on the fields. Yet beneath the peaceful rhythm there remained, for her, a thread of reflection. The case had been as much about the subtle movements of human character as it had been about the physical clues: the scuff on a sill, a cigarette butt, a crease in lace. It had been decided in moments and in glances, more than in any single piece of evidence. One afternoon, as she sat under the arbor in her garden, Inspector Graves came by, his expression uncharacteristically relaxed. "I've just come from much bearing," he said, as she poured him a cup of tea. "Rudge has entered a formal plea, manslaughter and theft. He's spared the court a lengthy trial, but the sentence will be long enough to keep him from troubling any more roses or lace curtains." Miss Marple nodded, neither triumphant nor somber. He was not, I think, a man who planned wickedness far in advance, but he was one who let a smaller wrong grow into a greater one, and that is often how it happens. By the time Leonard Price came to his window, it was already too late for him to step back. Graves leaned back in his chair, taking in the tidy garden. The papers will have it down to a neat story: stolen watch, blackmail, fatal meeting. But it was more complicated than that, wasn't it? They always are, Miss Marple said, because people are more complicated. Leonard Price was no innocent lamb, but his greed took a different shape from Rudge's. Each thought himself clever enough to manage the other, and in the end, both were wrong. They sat for a while in companionable quiet, the sound of bees in the lavender carrying across the still air. Then Graves said, "You know, if you ever tire of knitting and gardening, you'd make a fine addition to the force." She smiled, eyes twinkling. "And give up the advantage of being considered harmless?" "No, Inspector, I think I shall keep to my present occupation. It affords me the most comfortable view of the stage." That Sunday, she walked to church as usual. The congregation's glances toward Mrs. Withers were less frequent now, and Edith Taylor had begun to hold her head a little higher again. Mr. Nash had returned to his regular route, greeting parishioners with his salesman's cheer. Mrs. Pritchard no longer avoided the hedge by the Withers property, though she still cast a quick look toward the bay window as she passed. After the service, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Withers on the path. The older woman spoke with quiet gratitude. "I cannot think how I should have borne it without your steady counsel, Miss Marple. You never once made me feel foolish for not seeing what was in front of me. It is difficult to see when one is in the middle of things," Miss Marple said gently. "We are all inclined to trust those who have been in our lives a long time. Sometimes that trust is justified. Sometimes it is not. But I should think you will find, Mrs. Withers, that there are still more good and trustworthy souls in St. Mildred's than otherwise." Mrs. Withers gave her a small smile, and they parted at the lane. As the days shortened, the talk of the murder faded further into the background, replaced by the practicalities of harvest and preparations for the autumn fete. There was still the occasional flare of gossip when someone from outside the village mentioned the case, but within St. Mildred's, it was slowly being absorbed into that deep layer of remembered stories the village kept, to be taken out and told again when the mood struck. One evening, near the end of August, Miss Marple took her customary walk as the sun went down. The light caught the windows of the cottages, throwing brief, golden reflections onto the lanes. As she passed Mrs. Withers's house, she glanced, without turning her head, at the bay window. The lace curtain hung fresh and still, its scalloped hem uncreased, the faint summer breeze stirring it, just enough to let the last rays of sunlight spill into the room. She thought of that afternoon, the stir of the lace, the shadow behind it, the silence that had settled before Edith Taylor's startled cry. She thought of the coarse thread caught at the hem, the scuff on the sill, the droplet ring by the vase. None of them, taken alone, would have told the story. But together, they had woven it as neatly as the lace itself had been woven, and it had been her task to follow the pattern until the picture was clear. Reaching her own gate, she paused to take in the scent of the garden, lavender, roses, and the faint, comforting tang of earth cooling in the evening air. Human nature, she reflected, was very much like a garden. Seeds of all kinds were sown, not all of them visible at once, and the strongest growths were not always the most desirable. One needed patience to see which would come to bloom and when. Inside, she lit her lamp and settled into her chair with her knitting. Somewhere in the village, no doubt, someone was already retelling the story of the ghost in the lace curtain. Embellished a little here, shortened there, shaped to suit the listener. That was the way of stories and of villages, and Miss Marple was content to let it be so. The truth, after all, had been found, and the truth was enough. And if, in the months to come, another curtain were to stir in an unexpected way, or another thread were to catch her eye, she would be ready, as always, to see what pattern might be hidden in it. For now, the curtain at Mrs. Withers was only a curtain, and the evening was very peaceful indeed. The first week of September brought a sharper note to the mornings, the sort that hinted of frost somewhere far away, not yet arrived, but moving closer. St. Mildred's looked content beneath the pale blue sky, chimneys quiet for now, gardens still holding color, and the meadows edged with that faint silvering that meant summer's rain was loosening. Yet beneath the village's comfortable face, the story of Harold Rudge still lingered, now more as a cautionary tale than a raw wound. Miss Marple, however, knew that when a case closes in the eyes of the law, it does not necessarily close in the minds of those touched by it. There are always little frayed edges, questions that no one thinks to ask until after the dust has settled. One such frayed edge arrived in the form of Edith Taylor. Miss Marple encountered her on the path to the green one, bright afternoon. Edith looked more tired than usual, her neat attire slightly less precise. Her reticule clutched as though it were armor. "Miss Marple," she said in that firm, small voice of hers, "I've been wanting to apologize. I fear I gave you and Inspector Graves the wrong impression about Leonard Price." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on her. "Did you, my dear?" "Yes," Edith said, lowering her gaze. "I told the truth as far as it went, that I met him last December and sold him a sachet. But I didn't tell you that he wrote to me in July, said he might be coming back and that he had news Mrs. Withers would be interested in. I didn't reply. I thought it nonsense, but I didn't want to be drawn in." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It's not easy to admit a connection when a man is later found dead in your friend's home. But you did nothing to bring him harm, Edith, and you may have given me one more thread for the pattern." They parted with polite farewells, but as Miss Marple walked on, her thoughts turned over this new morsel. If Price had written to Edith, it meant he had her address, likely taken from that first meeting. It also meant that someone else might have seen or intercepted the letter if Edith had been careless with it. In a small community, letters were seldom entirely private. That evening, she penned a short note to Inspector Graves, suggesting he ask at the post office whether any letter for Edith Taylor had been handled unusually or noticed by others. She did not expect the result to change the outcome of the case, but she was unwilling to leave a door ajar, however slightly. The following day, Graves arrived at her gate, note in hand, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and mild astonishment. "You were right. Again. The postmistress remembers the letter. Said she commented on the unusual London postmark and that Harold Rudge happened to be in the shop at the time, posting one of his own. She saw him glance at the envelope and then look away too quickly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then he likely knew Price would be coming long before the tea. Enough time to plan his interception. Graves agreed, adding, "It doesn't alter the charge, but it does explain how Rudge was ready for him. I'll make sure it's noted in the file." The conversation turned to more ordinary village matters. But after Graves left, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. She disliked leaving any part of a puzzle unsettled, even if the picture was already clear. In the days that followed, the village began preparing for the harvest supper. Mrs. Hartley Pease had taken charge, of course, and was orchestrating the contributions of pies, pickles, and puddings with all the precision of a military campaign. Miss Marple was approached to donate her well-known seed cake, and she accepted with a smile, knowing full well that the real point was to ensure she attended. Don't sorrow. The night of the supper, the village hall glowed with lamplight, the tables laden with dishes, the air thick with the mingled scents of roast meats and autumn spices. Conversation flowed freely, though the tale of the lace curtain was inevitably revived here and there. Miss Marple found herself seated between Mrs. Pritchard and the vicar, both eager to share their theories, one well-rehearsed, the other muddled but earnest. She listened patiently, contributing only the occasional gentle question, and observed how the story had already begun to change in the retelling. In one version, Price had been seen climbing through the window himself. In another, the curtain had been found wrapped around his arm like a shroud. It was, she thought, the natural way of things. Facts softening at the edges, details shifting like sand, until the truth and the embroidery were woven together inextricably. Near the end of the evening, Edith Taylor approached her. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "that I might not attend the lace and lavender tea next year. I should hate to be reminded." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You'll decide in your own time, Edith. But often the best way to quiet a memory is to place a newer one over it." As she walked home under the stars, Miss Marple reflected that Edith's conscience, though needlessly burdened, was at least alive and healthy. It was a quality she had learned never to take for granted. The next morning brought a letter from Mrs. Clarice Bolt in St. Mary Mead, containing an amusing account of the latest church jumble and a passing remark about a tall, quick-moving stranger who had been seen asking questions about certain old families. Miss Marple smiled. She suspected Leonard Price had cast his net more widely than anyone realized, and that his interest in Mrs. Withers's possessions had been part of a larger scheme. Still, that particular web had been torn before it could catch anything else. One afternoon, as September tipped toward its close, she was in the garden clipping the last of the roses when Lily passed by on her way to the shop. The girl paused at the gate. "It's so quiet now," she said. "Sometimes I think it's too quiet. I suppose that's silly." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "Quiet after a storm always feels strange, but in time you'll find it comforting again." Lily nodded, smiling faintly, and went on her way. Miss Marple watched her go, thinking how quickly the village had reabsorbed the disturbance. The open window, the crease in the lace, the coarse fiber, all were already becoming part of the shared memory, tucked away to be brought out on winter evenings when stories were told for the pleasure of a shiver. As for Miss Marple, she was content to let the matter rest at last. She had other concerns now. Her dahlias were coming to their peak, and there was talk of an unusually harsh winter, which meant she must see to the insulation of the water pipes. But she also knew that somewhere, in some other village, another curtain might stir in a suspicious way. Another scuff might appear where none had been before. And when it did, she would notice. Not because she was seeking it, but because she had trained herself never to look past the smallest of signs. That evening, she sat in her parlor, the lamp casting its circle of light, her knitting needles clicking softly. The quiet was deep, but not empty. In her mind, the lace curtain at Mrs. Withers's hung clear and still, its faint crease smoothed away, no longer hiding the shadow of a man who had come there in greed and left in silence. It was, at last, only a piece of fabric again. Yet for her, it would always be the frame through which she had seen the truth. And as she worked, she smiled. For she knew that the truth, like lace, was made strong not by its smooth surface, but by the way its threads were bound together. October settled over St. Mildred's, with a calm that seemed, to those who had lived through the summer's events, almost unnaturally deep. The leaves along the lane turned to shades of copper and gold, and the afternoon light lay longer and softer over the gardens. The story of Harold Rudge's crime had taken its place among the village's catalog of remembered dramas, still told when the evenings grew dark early, but with less heat now, and more the tone of a cautionary tale than a fresh wound. Miss Marple, whose days had returned to their quiet cadence, found herself occasionally catching fragments of those retellings in the post office or the grocer's. She never corrected anyone, even when the details wandered far from the truth. People, she knew, needed their stories as much as they needed their facts, and often more so. It was on one such crisp afternoon, the sort that invited a brisk walk, that she encountered Mrs. Withers on the high street. The woman looked better than she had in weeks, her posture straighter, her hat more carefully chosen. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Withers said, taking her arm, "I can't tell you how grateful I am for your help. I still have moments when I think of that day. But I'm determined to let the garden and my friends occupy my mind now. Lily and I are even planning a smaller tea before Christmas, something cheerful." "That sounds an excellent idea," Miss Marple said warmly. "New memories are the best salve for old ones." Mrs. Withers hesitated. "Do you think people will still think of what happened?" Miss Marple's eyes were kind. "For a time, perhaps. But life moves forward, and people will think more of your scones than your scandals, if you give them the chance." They parted at the lane, and Miss Marple walked on toward the green, noting the small changes in the village since the summer. Mr. Nash was once again making his rounds, speaking of stationery and paper quality with an enthusiasm that had survived unscathed. Edith Taylor was back, at the church sewing circle, her manner brisk and her stitches as precise as ever, though she still avoided looking at Mrs. Withers' house when she passed. Mrs. Pritchard had taken to pausing by the hedge each morning, as though checking that no shadow lingered there. The bay window itself, with its lace curtain freshly laundered, had regained its place as a pleasant feature of the Withers home. On fine days it stood open, but the curtain no longer held the faint crease Miss Marple had noticed that first afternoon, and no coarse thread clung to its hem. It moved now only at the touch of the wind. One evening, Inspector Graves came by, bringing with him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like to see this," he said, unwrapping it to reveal the gold watch that had been at the heart of the affair. Returned to Mrs. Withers from the evidence room, she asked me to show you before she locked it away. Miss Marple held it lightly in her palm. The engraving on the back, "To E. Withers, with love," caught the lamplight. It was a handsome piece, still keeping time with a steady tick. "It's strange," Graves said, "how something so small could set in motion so much trouble." "Not so strange," Miss Marple replied. "It isn't the size of the object, but the size of the desire it awakens. For some, a watch is just a watch. For others, it is proof of belonging or the promise of gain." Graves studied her a moment. "You really do see the whole of it, don't you? Not just the act, but the thought behind it." She smiled. "It's the thought that tells you who a person is. The act is only the result." He left soon after, and Miss Marple sat for a while with the watch in her lap before returning it carefully to its box. As the weeks passed, autumn deepened. The harvest supper was declared a success. The church roof repairs were funded, and talk began to turn to Christmas festivities. By the end of October, the lace curtain in Mrs. Withers's drawing room was no longer spoken of in connection with the dead man. Instead, it was once again admired for its fine scalloped edge, said to have been made by Mrs. Withers' grandmother. One frosty morning in early November, Miss Marple took a walk through the meadow path toward the churchyard. The air was bright and sharp, and the grass crackled faintly underfoot. She paused at the top of the slope, looking down over the village. the chimneys sending up their faint plumes of smoke. It struck her, not for the first time, how very ordinary it all looked, how little the surface revealed of the human dramas that played out in its lanes and parlors. She thought of Leonard Price, whose greed had brought him here, of Harold Rudge, whose fear and desire for concealment had led to his undoing, of Edith Taylor, whose conscience had been pricked by even the smallest part she had played. And she thought of the lace curtain itself, fluttering on that summer afternoon, thing of beauty that had, quite unintentionally, framed a scene of death. Life, she reflected, was much the same. Beauty and danger, kindness and malice, often lived side by side, separated only by something as thin and easily moved as a curtain. When she returned home, she set water to boil for tea and settled into her chair with her knitting. Outside, the wind stirred the last of the leaves from the sycamore, sending them skittering down the lane. Somewhere in the village, Mrs. Withers would be preparing for her winter tea. Lily bustling about with trays and tablecloths, the lace curtain hanging ready at the bay window. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she worked, her thoughts drifting ahead to the winter months. She did not seek out mysteries. Life had a way of delivering them without being asked. But she knew, as surely as the seasons turned, that sooner or later another puzzle would arrive. And when it did, she would see the first small sign others overlooked, the thread in the lace that didn't quite match. For now, though, the village was at peace, and the curtain was only a curtain. And that, she thought, was a very pleasant way for things to be. The last Sunday of November brought a still, pewter sky to St. Mildred's, the air cool enough to hold the faint smell of coal smoke. The village had settled entirely into its winter rhythm. Fewer lingering chats in the lane, more drawn curtains at dusk. For Miss Marple, it was an afternoon like any other. The church service, a brief stop at the vicarage, and then a walk home along the high street. But as she passed Mrs. Withers' house, she noticed something she had not seen since the summer. The bay window stood open a few inches, and the lace curtain moved in the faint breeze. It no longer held any shadow or crease, yet it stirred in her memory like a bookmark pressed between familiar pages. Mrs. Withers herself appeared at the door, cheeks pink from the cold. "Miss Marple, do come in for a moment. I've just been telling Lily we mustn't be afraid of an open window, even in winter." Miss Marple smiled and stepped inside. The drawing room was warm, the lace curtain glowing faintly in the pale light. Tea was set out, and Lily hovered with the teapot, looking more at ease than she had in months. As they spoke of small matters, the weather, the church bazaar, Mrs. Withers reached into a drawer and drew out the gold watch. "I've decided to keep it here in the drawing room," she said. "Not hidden away. I'd rather it be a reminder of what's past than something I'm afraid to look at." Miss Marple approved. "Objects carry the meaning we give them. You are choosing to give it back its innocence." Mrs. Withers's eyes softened. "You know, I sometimes think you understood this business better than anyone else. Not just who did it, but why." Miss Marple set down her teacup. It was never simply about the watch, or even about Leonard Price. Rudge's crime began the moment he decided to keep something that wasn't his. Price's death was just the inevitable end of that decision. In such cases, the clues are often not the ones people expect: a fiber, a scuff, a crease in lace. It is the small, human habits behind them that matter. Lily, who had been pretending not to listen, said quietly, "And you saw all that from the first?" Miss Marple's smile was mild. "Not all, my dear. But I saw enough to know where to look." People think lace is delicate, but it is made strong by the way its threads hold each other. So too with the truth. It takes the smallest connections to make the whole pattern. There was a comfortable silence after that. The tea was poured again, the fire crackled, and the lace curtain stirred once more, now only in answer to the wind. When Miss Marple stepped back out into the lane, the sky was beginning to darken, the first lamps glimmering behind windows. The village looked entirely at peace, and perhaps it was. Yet she knew, as she had always known, that even the most peaceful places held their shadows, shadows that could pass unseen unless one learned to watch for the flicker. She paused for a last glance at the bay window. The lace curtain hung smooth, innocent of creases, the ghost it had once framed, gone forever. And as she turned toward home, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a story completed. Not by drama or spectacle, but by the patient weaving together of every small thread until the whole could be seen clearly at last.